I was standing in our sunroom in Oakville, 73 years old, holding a cup of Earl Grey that had gone completely cold, staring at my husband of 11 years as he said 4 words I never expected to hear. "Margaret, I can see." The cup slipped from my fingers. It didn't shatter. It landed on the carpet, the tea spreading in a slow dark stain, and I just stood there, unable to move, unable to breathe, unable to make a single sound. Because my husband had been blind since the age of 42, I had read to him every night for 11 years. I had learned to describe sunsets and the faces of our grandchildren and the colors of leaves in October so that he could see them through my words. And now he was standing in our sunroom on a Tuesday morning in November, looking directly at me, with both eyes open and clear and focused. He had been able to see the whole time. I want to tell you that I handled it gracefully. I want to tell you that I took a breath, sat down, and asked calm questions like the retired school principal I am. But I didn't. I turned around, walked to the front door, put on my coat, and drove to my daughter's house without saying a single word. I sat in her driveway for 20 minutes before I could even go inside. Let me go back to the beginning, because none of this makes sense without it. I was 61 years old when I met my husband. My children, my daughter, and my son had been gently, persistently, sometimes not so gently, suggesting that I try one of those dating apps for people over 50. My son had even set up a profile for me without asking. I was mortified. I had been widowed for 6 years by then, and I had made peace with my life. I had my routine. I had my book club, my garden, my Wednesday morning walks along the waterfront with my friend Pauline. I had 2 grandchildren I adored, and a small but very comfortable house in Oakville that felt entirely mine. I did not need a man. That is what I told my daughter on a Sunday afternoon when she brought it up again over coffee. She looked at me the way she used to look at me when she was 16 and I was being unreasonable. She said, "Mom, you're not dead. You're allowed to want company." I told her I had plenty of company. She said, "You know what I mean." I did know what she meant. And the truth I didn't say out loud was that I was lonely. In the particular way, you can only be lonely when you've had a genuinely good marriage and then lost it. Not desperate, not falling apart, just aware, every single evening, of the quiet on the other side of the bed. So I agreed to go to one event, a dinner hosted by a senior center in Burlington, not a speed dating thing. My daughter was very clear about that, just a social dinner for people over 60. 12 people at a long table in a private room at an Italian restaurant on Brant Street. I wore a blue dress I hadn't worn in 3 years and spent 40 minutes doing my hair, which I immediately felt ridiculous about. He was seated across from me. My husband, I'll call him by his name, Thomas, was 64 at the time, recently retired from a long career as a civil engineer with the city of Hamilton. He was tall and lean and had the careful, deliberate movements of someone who had learned to navigate the world differently. He used a white cane. His eyes were pale gray, and they pointed slightly to the left of wherever he was facing, the way eyes sometimes do when vision is gone. He spoke quietly but precisely. He was funny in a dry, understated way that I appreciated immediately. He was blind. Had been, he told me over dinner, since his early 40s, a progressive retinal condition that had taken his sight gradually and then completely. He lived independently, he was quick to add. He cooked his own meals, managed his own finances, took the GO train to Toronto when he wanted to visit. He corrected himself with a small, wry smile, his sister in Etobicoke. I liked him before dessert arrived. We exchanged numbers. He texted first, the following morning, which surprised me. We had coffee that week at a cafe in downtown Oakville, and he navigated the space with his cane so easily and confidently that I had to consciously stop myself from hovering. That had been a habit with my late husband near the end of his illness, the hovering, and I recognized it in myself and let it go. We began seeing each other. That small irony never escaped me. Over the following months, I found myself adapting naturally to his way of experiencing things. I described menus when we went to restaurants. I narrated the news when we watched television together. I started noticing things I had never particularly noticed before: the specific sound of the wind in the maple in my backyard, the smell of rain on the lake, the exact texture of a good piece of bread, because he noticed everything that wasn't sight, with an attention that was almost startling. My daughter met him after 4 months and called me afterward to say she liked him enormously. My son took a little longer. But by our first winter together, Thomas had been to both their homes for dinner and won them over in his quiet, thorough way. I did not decide to learn blind accessibility skills to impress him. I want to be clear about that. I did it because I wanted to understand his life. I took a workshop at the CNIB on audio description. I learned basic Braille, not fluently. I won't pretend just enough to leave him notes he could read without his phone. I rearranged my kitchen so that everything had a consistent place he could rely on when he was at my house. These things took time and effort, and I did not resent a single minute of it. That is what I need you to understand, before everything else. We were together for 2 years before he proposed. He did it on the back deck of my house on a Saturday evening in late August, with the lake just visible through the trees and the neighborhood cicadas going at full volume. He had planned it carefully. He had spoken to my daughter first, which she told me about only years later, weeping with laughter, and he had a ring that his sister had helped him choose at a jeweler on Queen Street West. He got down on one knee on my back deck and said, "Dorothy, I know I am not an easy man to be with. I know there are things I cannot give you. But I have loved you in a way I did not expect to love anyone again, and I would like to spend whatever time we have left making that very clear to you." I said yes before he finished the sentence. We were married the following June. A small wedding, 40 people, my sister's backyard in Guelph, his sister and brother-in-law, both our sets of children, my grandchildren as flower girl and ring bearer. My son gave a speech that made everyone cry, including him. We danced slowly in the grass, while someone played Joni Mitchell from a speaker on the porch. I was 63 years old, and I was happier than I had been in a long time. The years that followed were, I want to say this carefully, genuinely good. Not perfect. We had adjustments, the way any two people who have lived separately for decades have adjustments. He was particular about silence in the mornings. I was particular about the thermostat. We disagreed about how to spend winter. He wanted to stay in Ontario. I wanted to go somewhere warm, and we eventually compromised on a February week in Victoria every year, which we both loved. He came to my book club Christmas party and charmed everyone. I went to his former engineering colleagues' retirement dinners and learned more about municipal drainage systems than I ever expected to know. I read to him every night. That part was not a duty or an accommodation. It became something I looked forward to. That hour before sleep, the two of us in bed with the lamp on my side, me reading aloud from whatever we had chosen together. We went through all of Hilary Mantel. We went through Patrick DeWitt and Alice Munro and a great deal of Canadian history. He listened with his whole body, and sometimes he would ask me to go back and read a paragraph again, and he would say something about it that made me see it entirely differently. That was our life. That was what I thought our life was. And then came the Tuesday in November. I should give you the context of that morning, because it matters. I had come downstairs at 7:30 to find him already in the sunroom. Unusual for him, he was not a morning person, and he was sitting in the armchair by the window. I made tea. I brought 2 cups in, and when I set his cup on the side table, I noticed something. His eyes were following me. Not the way eyes sometimes track movement out of old reflex, not the slight involuntary response to light that I had occasionally noticed before. He was watching me. His gaze moved with me as I crossed the room, found me when I turned, stayed with me when I sat down across from him. I sat very still. I set down my own cup, and I said, "Thomas." He looked at me directly, not to the left, directly. "How long?" I said. My voice came out much steadier than I felt. He closed his eyes. He pressed his hands together in his lap the way he did when he was composing himself, and then he told me. He had begun to see again approximately 14 months after we met. A treatment, an emerging therapy he had been enrolled in through the Hamilton Eye Institute, which had been in clinical trial and which he had not told me about because he had not believed it would work, or so he said. The treatment had begun to restore partial vision in his right eye 18 months into our relationship. By the time he proposed to me, he had had functional vision in that eye for several months. By the time we married, both eyes had recovered to approximately 80% capacity. He had been able to see me read to him every night for 9 years. I have a very clear memory of the next few minutes. I remember standing up. I remember walking to the front hallway. I remember putting on my winter coat over my dressing gown, which would have looked absolutely deranged to anyone passing by. I remember that I did not cry until I was in the car. And then I cried for the entire 16-minute drive to my daughter's house, which is not something I recommend. My daughter's name is Christine. She opened the door in her own dressing gown, took one look at my face, and said, "Come inside right now." I sat at her kitchen table while she made coffee. Real coffee, not tea. She has always known when I need coffee instead of tea, and I told her everything. She sat across from me with her hands wrapped around her mug, and she listened without interrupting, which is a quality I raised her to have and for which I was deeply grateful in that moment. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Mum, did he say why he didn't tell you?" I realized I had not stayed long enough to hear the why. I want to be honest about what I felt in those first days, because I think it matters. The feeling was not straightforward. It would be simpler if it had been pure anger, or pure grief, or pure betrayal. But it was layered in a way that I found difficult to separate. Part of me was furious. 11 years. He had watched me. All those moments I had not known were being observed getting dressed in the morning, crying at the end of Middlemarch, singing badly to the radio while I cooked. All the small unguarded moments that a person only has when they believe they are not being watched. He had seen all of it. That felt like a profound invasion of something I couldn't quite name. Part of me was bewildered. We had built accommodation into the architecture of our entire marriage. I had organized my home around his needs. I had learned things, changed things, arranged my life around a condition that did not exist, and I did not know how to feel about that, not because I resented the effort. I genuinely did not, but because it meant something different now. The gesture I had made toward his life had been made toward something that wasn't real. And part of me, the part I was least prepared for, was hurt in a quieter, more fundamental way. He had not trusted me enough to tell me. For 9 years, he had looked at me every day and chosen, again and again, not to say, "Dorothy, I can see you." He had chosen the secret over the truth, and he had made that choice thousands of times, and I had not known. I did not speak to him for 5 days. Christine came with me on the 6th day when I went back to the house. She waited in the car I asked her to, and I went inside and found Thomas in the kitchen. He had not been sleeping. That was clear. He looked older than he had a week before, and he had the careful stillness of someone who has been waiting for something they are not sure is coming. I sat down at the kitchen table. I said, "Tell me." He told me everything. The clinical trial had been real, and it had been uncertain. He had not believed it would succeed. He had enrolled before we met, in a period of his life when he had been trying everything available and beginning to accept that nothing would work. When the treatment had begun to show results, he had been so stunned, so completely unprepared, that he had not known how to speak about it. He had thought, and here he paused for a long time, he had thought he would tell me immediately. And then a week passed, and then a month, and the longer he waited, the more impossible it became. He told me about a woman he had been with before the blindness took hold completely. A woman he had loved, and who had, when his sight deteriorated beyond a certain point, ended their relationship. She had been kind about it. She had said she simply didn't have the capacity for that kind of caregiving, and she had said it gently, but she had still said it, and then she had still left. He had never fully recovered from what that told him about his own lovability, about whether he was loved for himself or tolerated for the sake of decency. When his vision returned, he was terrified. Not of the vision. He was terrified of what it meant to have it. Because I had fallen in love with a blind man. I had chosen him specifically, deliberately, in full knowledge of what that meant, and he could not bear the thought that if he told me, something would shift, that I might love him differently if he was no longer the man I had chosen, that he would never again be entirely certain which man I was staying for. I sat with that for a long time. Our doctor, and here I will say that I am grateful we had her, because she is a remarkable woman. Our family doctor suggested we see a therapist who specialized in late-life relationships. I was skeptical. I am of a generation that worked things out privately. But Christine pushed, and Thomas agreed immediately, and I went. 3 sessions in, the therapist said something that I have thought about many times since. She said that secrets in long relationships are rarely about the person keeping them. They are almost always about fear specifically, about the fear that the truth will cost you the love you are most afraid to lose. She looked at both of us and she said, "The question isn't whether there was a lie. The question is what the lie was protecting." I did not forgive him in a single moment. That is not how forgiveness works, at least not at my age. It came in pieces, over several months. The way the light comes back in February gradually. Then more, then enough that you stop noticing the dark. There were conversations that were hard. There were nights when I lay awake feeling the loss of what I had thought our marriage was. There were moments when I caught him watching me from across a room and felt something complicated and not entirely comfortable. But there were also other things. There was the afternoon I came home to find him standing in the backyard looking at the maple tree, his face tilted up, entirely still, in a way I recognized from years of watching him listen. He heard me come through the door and he said, without turning around, "The leaves are almost gone." I had forgotten what that looked like, and he said it with the same attention, the same care that he had always brought to the things he couldn't see. There was the evening he asked me to read aloud to him. We had not done it since before the sunroom. I had assumed we wouldn't anymore, that it had been a workaround, a compensation, something belonging to the life we thought we were living. But he asked, and I picked up the book, and we sat in bed with the lamp on my side, and I read to him, and he listened exactly as he always had. I stopped after a few pages. I said, "You don't need me to do this anymore." He said, "I know, I want you to." I kept reading. I am 73 now. We have been married 11 years. My grandchildren are in high school and university and have no idea that any of this happened, which is how it should be. My son knows. Finally, I told him last spring, after enough time had passed that I could tell it steadily, and he was quiet for a long time, and then he said, "Are you okay, Mom?" Which is exactly the right thing to ask, and exactly what I raised him to say. I am asked sometimes, by Christine especially, whether I wish I had known earlier, whether I wish he had told me the moment it happened, or before the proposal, or before the wedding. The honest answer is that I don't know. I know that I wish he had trusted me with it. I know that the not trusting was the wound that took longest to heal, longer than the deception itself. Because the deception came from fear, and I understand fear. I have been afraid of things too. I have held things close because I was terrified of what the air would do to them. But I also know this. Every single choice I made freely. Every accommodation, every adaptation, every evening of reading aloud, I made those choices for the man I loved, and I would make them again. The truth of what he was going through, the years of blindness, the loss, the slow return of something he had grieved, all of that was real. I was not wrong about who he was. I was only missing one piece of the story. He is in the kitchen right now making dinner. He is, as it turns out, an excellent cook, which I had always known, and the only difference is that now he does not need me to read the label on the spice jars, and sometimes I catch him looking at me from the stove with an expression that I am still, if I'm honest, learning to read. I am 63% at peace with what happened. I think that is a reasonable number. I think at my age, 63% is something you build a life on. The tea stain, by the way, never fully came out of the sunroom carpet. I left it there on purpose. My daughter thinks I am being dramatic. I think I am being accurate. Some marks are just the record of what happened, and there is no particular reason to cover them up. I still read to him every night. That part, at least, was never a lie.